Okay, we get to come back to John of Damascus and those Christological heresies. Now we're going to tackle the two that arose in the aftermath of the Council of Chalcedon. But after we get through these are a little tedious. Then we finally get to see the orthodox model. That's the one you've been waiting for. So without further ado, let's jump right back into our whiteboard discussion.
And yet they must be distinct, because Eutyches is wrong. Now after this council there was still some debate, which brings us to our fifth Christological heresy, the Monophysites. Obviously they didn't call themselves this. You will still hear groups like this today who were a product of this debate. There are groups in Egypt like the Coptic Church, in parts of Syria, some of the Syrian churches. They don't call themselves Monophysites, but they're a result of this because they rejected the Council of Chalcedon. But they're trying to explain how, while the Father and the Son are equally divine, the Son is incarnate and remains fully human. And to talk about these with two natures would be to inevitably split Jesus back into two persons. And so they reject two natures and insist that Christ is one nature. That's what the word monophysite means, from the Greek word phusis, one nature. Now the problem is when they say one nature, their opponents are going to think in terms of two natures and ask, which nature is this? Is this the human nature, or is it the divine nature? Well, they've already said that the Father and the Son are equally divine, so they must be saying that Christ has no human nature. Clearly they didn't mean to imply that, and in later ecumenical dialogues in modern times, the ban of excommunication has been lifted against these groups we would today call Oriental Orthodox Christians. But in their day, they were heard as heretical because they seemed to deny a human nature, or at least slip back into some sort of Eutychian mixed nature, because they would only say one nature. That brings us to a compromise that was attempted, which is the sixth and last Christological heresy we will discuss. The Monothelites. Now it's getting really complicated here. Like Monophysites who believed in one nature, the Monothelites believed in one will, or thelema in Greek. And again, they're trying to reject Arius. They're trying to be orthodox. They insist the Father and the Son are fully and equally divine. But here, they think they have a compromise for how to understand the incarnation of Christ. So I'm going to draw Stigman Jesus here with a really big head, just to give us room to explain their model. They think they have a solution by questioning, what do we mean by nature, especially a human nature? Well, we say a human has a body and a soul. Well, what are the parts of a human soul? If we had asked that question, maybe we could have avoided some of the earlier controversies. And they are going to divide the human soul into numerous parts, but for our discussion there are three that really matter. So again, I'm going to draw this dividing line down the figure of Jesus, but we're going to divide Jesus' human nature, or human soul, into three further parts. We're going to talk about his his human mind, his human energy, and his human will. And just so you know, corresponding to this, we're going to have to figure out the relationship between the divine mind, the divine energy, and the divine will. But we'll come back to this side in a moment. I can explain each of these fairly briefly because we understand what a human mind is, to be rational. For example, I know in my mind that it's unhealthy for me to eat that fourth donut. That would be irrational of me to do it. Now when it comes to the idea of energy, this is where it's more complicated. We've seen this word before, energy or operation. And the idea for us, I think, at least in this debate, would be to think in terms of what is a natural instinct or a natural impulse. What is natural action or work or operation? So, for example, my stomach would naturally get hungry and have a rumbly in my tumbly, but the question is, what would be the rational food to eat? And then finally there is the will. which is the highest part of the soul for the people in this debate. Even though my mind sometimes knows I shouldn't eat that donut, and even though my stomach is not really rumbling and wanting more food, sometimes my weak will eat that donut anyway, my fallen will, because the will is the highest faculty of the soul. Another example would be if someone were to place their hand unknowingly on a hot stove. Immediately, the mind would be engaged. You would know it's irrational to put your hand on a hot stove, but before even thinking about it, your impulse, your energy, you see, the natural energy or operation in you would remove your hand from you. However, it is theoretically possible, even though you know it's irrational, even though your natural impulse would be to remove your hand, you could be, like say Thomas Cranmer during the English Reformation, you could hold your hand over that stake, over that torch, while your hand withers away, because he used that hand to recant Protestantism. And before he was burned at the stake, he insisted that the hand, as he said it, the hand that recanted should burn first. So you see, we have three faculties in our soul, at least three, and they're ordered from mind, energy, and will. So, if we then put the corresponding divine nature back on this side, Christ, of course, has a human mind. And, of course, the divine energy or divine power, Christ has that. We talked about that with Nestorius. He can calm the winds and the waves, multitude the fish and the loaves. And then we would also say, for this Monothelite camp, that what we have in Christ is a union of the divine and the human with one will in Christ. Now again, so far so good. This looks like a nice solution. Until someone comes along and asks, which will is this? Is this the human will or is this the divine will? Because we've already said that Christ has a fully equal with the Father. And if you remember our early video, we said that there must be only one divine will shared by all three persons. You wouldn't want the Father wanting one thing and the Son wanting another. So if this is the case, then this is actually heard as teaching that Christ has a divine will, but no human will. And if that's the case, then Christ is not fully human. And if he's not fully human, then this does not meet the standard of Chalcedon and the standard of orthodoxy. Now again, the folks who held to this are still around in places like some Syrian churches. They would not call themselves Monothelites, but they're a product of these debates. The good news is that in later and modern ecumenical dialogues, the ban of excommunication has been lifted. Now, once more, I could review how these Christological heresies all reflect what is the ultimate declaration for dogma when it comes to Christology, and that's the Council of Chalcedon's definition, or the Chalcedonian definition. Christ must be fully divine, because Arius is wrong. Christ must be fully human, because Apollinaris is wrong. Christ's two natures must be united, because Nestorius split these two natures into two persons. And Christ's two natures yet must be distinct, because Eutyches had blended or mixed these two natures. Once you see that, you have to see that the Monophysites have to explain which nature are they talking about, a divine or a human. And if you're talking about a part of the human nature, the Monothelites would have to explain what are they talking about. Is this will divine or human? And so Chalcedon gives us the standard for how the ancient Orthodox Church understood the Incarnation. But now I still haven't given us what is the Orthodox model. This is where we've been waiting for, if we were to draw what it looks like.
Okay, I know we were just getting to the good part, but I need to pause here to make sure we have one more structural piece in place. Because we were very precise with our terminology and categories when we were talking about the doctrine of the Trinity. And those same terms and categories are now being used with Christology, and we need to make sure we're keeping them all in line. If you look at this slide that I have here for you, I've tried to compare, because when it comes to the triune God, of course there are three persons who share one nature. One nature. But when we talk about Christ incarnate, we're talking about one person who has two natures. Two natures. Now, what's added to this is that when you have a nature, with that comes an energy. Remember, we use that word several times now. Energy or operation. And we said with the Trinity that there are three persons, but they're always cooperating. One operation, one energy. Not three divine judges, not three divine saviors, three persons sharing one act of judging or saving or creating. So it is with Christ's human nature and his divine nature. Christ is one person. He's the only one doing it. And yet there are always these two natures which include two energies, two operations. Jesus in his human nature can touch you with his human hand, and at the same time, he can heal you with his divine power. Now, this brings up an interesting way that we have to talk about Christ's incarnation. In two-nature Christology, we have to affirm that Jesus is both fully divine and fully human, which means that in his divine nature he is immortal, immutable, impassible, etc., etc. And yet in his human nature, to be fully human, he must be mortal, mutable, passible, etc., etc. Is this a contradiction? No. It's a paradox. A mystery. How can Jesus be both immortal and mortal? Well, let's test drive this. First question is supposed to be the easy answer. Can God die? I mean, according to classical Christian theology, the Almighty who made heaven and earth cannot die. Nothing could harm God. But now the harder question. Did God die? And according to the gospel, the answer is yes. God, the Son, the second person of the Trinity, in his human nature, died. Okay, I'm going to try it again. Let's talk about immutability. Can God change? Now, we'll get to debate that later. Modern theology, that's up for questions. But in classical theism, it doesn't even make sense to talk about God changing. How would God go from being omnipresent to a genie in a bottle and be absent from the rest of the cosmos? No, of course not. God is always all-present all the time. So, according to classical theism, God cannot change. But now, according to Christian teaching, did God change? And the answer, paradoxically, is yes. God changed. God the Son, in his human nature, changed. He was a, 6-pound baby, wrapped in swaddling clothes, lying in a manger, and then he grew to be something like a 5'3", 140-pound Galilean man. He changed. He grew in his human nature. And yet he remained immutable, omnipresent, etc., in his divine nature. Getting the hang of this? Let's try one more try. Can God suffer? Now again, that's up for debate in modern theology, but according to classical theism, it doesn't make any sense at all to talk about God suffering. We can debate it later, but can you poke God? God doesn't have a body. Can you harm God? No, what would that even mean? So, if you can't harm God, God is impassible. He cannot suffer. Can God suffer? At least according to classical Christianity, that's the easy answer, no. But now, did God suffer? And the answer, mysteriously, is yes. God the Son, in his human nature, suffered and died. Now, that doesn't mean the divine nature was killed. The divine nature was obliterated. The divine nature, whatever. What would it even mean for the divine nature to be poked or crucified or killed? None of that happened. What we're talking about is the divine person, God the Son, in his human nature, suffered and died and rose again. So now by keeping these two things in check, we can recognize that this orthodox way of talking about Christ incarnate is paradoxical. It looks contradictory, but we have all the pieces and categories in place to talk about Christ. So let's go back to that whiteboard and see what is the orthodox model for Christology.
the Incarnation. But now I still haven't given us what is the orthodox model. This is where we've been waiting for. If we were to draw what it looks like for Christ to be fully human while also remaining fully divine, we would get this orthodox model. I can sense the anticipation building. It's like I need a drum roll here. All right, this that you're seeing is Jesus' human nature. The human body is visible, the human soul is invisible. Then what would it mean for him to also be fully divine while remaining fully human? Here it is. It's a mystery. Okay, maybe that's a bit anticlimactic. But here's what I mean. It is the heretical versions of the Incarnation that constantly seem to run into problems. But we should admit, they do a very good job of explaining how we could understand the Incarnation. The problem is, when you explain it, you remove the mystery. I can demonstrate this for you. Nestorius thought he could explain the Incarnation. He said you would take 100% of Jesus, the human, and 100% of God, the Son, and you would add them together, join them in one person, and you would get 200% Christ, because he is Jesus, the human, and God, the Son. That's great math, but it's heretical, and the Orthodox party is trying to be apophatic. Don't say this. On the other side, we had Eutyches. Against Nestorius, he thinks he can explain the Incarnation very simply. You simply take 50% of humanity, and then you also add to that 50% of divinity, and what you get is 100% Christ. Now again, the math works fine. This is great math, but it's terrible theology. And the Orthodox party, being apophatic and telling you what not to say, is saying, don't say that. What do we say? That comes right back here to the middle. What we say is a mystery. Now that doesn't mean we don't say anything. We continue to confess what we have always said. Christ is fully human, fully divine. But how do we explain it? Well, it can't be explained. It must be believed. It is a matter of faith. I think the ancient church is at its best and best understood in terms of apophaticism. The Orthodox councils are telling you what not to say. But I don't want to just leave you with that abstract and with that negative approach. I do think that John of Damascus and others before him used this one very powerful image. They used the example of a flaming sword. I'm not going to try to draw a sword for you, but imagine there's a sword. Okay, I will try to draw a sword. Now imagine you have thrust it into the fire, and this sword is now in flames. Notice this sword in nature is steel, but it also has been fused with, but not confused with, fire. So now this sword has, as it were, two natures joined together, and with that go two energies, or capacities, or operation. This sword could simultaneously cut you, and it could burn you, just like Christ could touch you with his human hand and also heal you with his divine power. So now if we applied this to the Incarnation, what we would see in Christ is the visible human nature. And yet what we would also believe in, if we could see the Shekinah glory of God radiating through Christ and in Christ and from Christ, would be his divine nature. But you can only see this with the eyes of faith, because it is, after all, a mystery.
Yes, God changed. 5'3", 140-pound Galilean. He changed. He grew. It's my neighbor John mowing the yard. Hey John, don't mind me. Just working from home. He change and shrink down to being a genie in a bottle. It's John again. You already mowed that part, John?